After practicing for thousands of hours, playing hundreds of gigs, and teaching thousands of students online, I've discovered the best way to improve as a jazz musician. And the best thing about that is it only requires you to do one thing a month, so let's talk about it. So having had thousands of students go through my online courses and within my Inner Circle membership, I'm in this unique position where I'm able to analyze data of what's worked best for the students that have worked with me, the things that are working for them and the things that are not. And while of course this can differ from person to person depending on their musical needs and deficiencies, there's one thing that really ties everything together and really has helped everybody improve the most. Now, it's important to mention that a lot of people come to me for help because they feel lost with how to improve as a jazz musician. Oftentimes they've been surfing YouTube for years and making little bits of progress here and there, but ultimately not making really deep progress and constantly feeling frustrated with their jazz solos and playing abilities. They bought all the music books, they may have even had private lessons before, but again, everything just seems too overwhelming and they're not really feeling like they're making the progress they want. And also, most people that come to me for help have very little time to practice. This is something I hear all the time, is that they have a family, they have a job, they have all these things going on in their life. This is really their hobby. And so they're not really quite sure how they can improve, especially when everybody has told them that they need to practice for incredible hours in order to improve at all. And over the last decade of working with people just like this, I've really come down to what I firmly believe is the best way to go forward about learning jazz for the long term. Now, the last part I said, the long term, is really important because what I've also learned over the years is that if you're practicing in such a way that you're going to burn out and lose your motivation and end up just stopping, then it really doesn't matter at all. And so really the way I like to think about things is how can you make good results quicker over time in your jazz playing so that you're proud of the solos you're creating. Now, really for me, what it all comes down to is what's called the 80-20 rule, or also known as the Pareto principle. And this principle states that 80% of the results that you're getting are caused by 20% of the actions you're actually taking. So to bring this into jazz terms, 80% of the great jazz solos you're now taking, the better comping, the better bass lines, all that stuff is coming from 20% of the things that you're practicing. To flip this around on its head, it's also saying that 80% of the things you're practicing probably aren't getting you the best results, and you'd be better off spending more time on the 20% of things that actually do. So for me, there's this sweet spot of practicing the right things, the 20%, but then also practicing sustainably so that you're actually going to make progress over time. So let's quickly talk about what that 20% is. And remember, I'm basing all of this off of thousands of students that I've taught and thousands of hours of practice I've put in myself. What it all boils down to, if you want to become a better jazz musician, is learning jazz standards. Within the jazz standards, all the information that you need is there. All the lessons that you need to learn are there. You've got the chords that you need to know. You've got the chord progressions that you need to know. You've got the jazz language that the jazz musicians you love listening to are playing over top of those chord changes. Basically, everything that you can do in practice can and should be applied to a jazz standard. And even when I go to great jazz clubs like here in New York City, the Village Vanguard, Smalls, where a lot of the musicians are playing original music, one thing is absolutely certain, is that all of these musicians have 100% mastered the art of improvising over jazz standards and the chord progressions within them. So this is why the main thing that we do in my Inner Circle membership is we learn one jazz standard a month, which brings us over to the sustainability portion of it. Our brains need goals in order to feel like we're progressing, moving forward, and to get that dopamine hit that we're all looking for. However, if we have way too many goals going at once, then it can easily get derailed and we fail and we don't actually meet those expectations, and therefore we get frustrated and usually leave out and start quitting. But when we're just focusing on one thing a month, the one goal being learning a jazz standard by the end of the month, then we can really start focusing in on that one jazz standard, going deep into it, not worrying about a bunch of other things that we could be doing, and making it more of a singularity of focus that can really help us. Now, when I'm talking about learning a new jazz standard in 1 month, obviously I'm talking about learning the melody and learning the chords. But there are certainly other things that we need to be doing in order to focus on that jazz standard. And in comes my 3 pillars of jazz improvisation. These are the things that all jazz musicians need to be working on. The first pillar is called technique. And when I'm talking about technique, it could, yes, be instrument-specific technique, like trumpets doing long tones, like guitar players working on fretboard mastery, like bass players working on their walking bass lines, or piano players working on their chords. But when it comes to jazz improvisation, there's certain technique that everybody needs to work on, like connecting chord tones over the chord progressions to a jazz standard, like playing guide tones, like working on approach tones, all these sorts of things that help you unlock your instrument and facility that is required of jazz improvisation. So what I like to really focus on is focus on chord tones and mapping those out, connecting them together, as well as approach tones, figuring out how we can approach those actual chord tones. And that's what I consider a main focus for jazz technique. And of course, applying that over top of a jazz standard, the jazz standard that you're working on during 1 month. Now, the second pillar is jazz language. In order to start actually sounding like a great jazz improviser over that jazz standard, you need to learn some actual jazz language. And jazz language is simply like a lick or a solo or an etude. An etude is simply just a composed solo, and that's what I do with my students. So essentially what you're doing is you're learning different phrases that you could play over top of that song form, and you're understanding the techniques that the jazz musicians are using to achieve that result. Now, the third pillar is learning jazz standards, which we've already talked about. And so again, the beautiful thing is everything that we need to work on, whether it be instrument-specific technique, jazz technique, or learning jazz language, all of that can be applied to a jazz standard. In fact, there's really nothing that can't be applied to a jazz standard when it comes to jazz and jazz improvisation. Even just imagine if you're a guitar player learning different voicings that you could use, or chord melody if you're trying to work on that, over top of that jazz standard, everything can be applied. So the way I like to think about it is like, what would happen if you did this for 1 year? What if you learned one new jazz standard every single month, knew the melody, the chords, were able to apply some form of jazz improvisation or instrument-specific technique, and we're learning jazz solos and etudes every single month, and you didn't have to worry about everything else. It was just one jazz standard that you had to focus on. After 12 jazz standards, you can see how you start getting a compounding effect. Each jazz standard makes every other jazz standard easier. The more jazz language you learn over just one jazz standard, the more you start realizing it applies over the 2-5-1 chord progressions in the next jazz standard. The more technique that you do, the more the muscle memory and the things you're hearing in your head start to come together and start becoming more organic when you start improvising. So yes, my friends, in my opinion, the best way to improve as a jazz musician is to learn jazz standards, but more specifically, learn one jazz standard a month so that you're really focusing in on one at a time. So you may be wondering, well, what's the first step? Okay, so if you want to learn a new jazz standard, one thing that you're gonna have to learn is the chords. So on the screen I have right now, how to memorize the chords to a jazz standard. This is gonna help give you the knowledge to get started right away so you can start tackling this goal of learning one jazz standard a month. So go ahead and click that video on the screen right now. If you like this video, make sure you hit the thumbs up, and of course, make sure you subscribe if you've never subscribed to the channel before, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.